nice to see you all here. Welcome. We're going to be having a conversation about what a competitive applicant is. And as with all of our open access education talks, we're going to be focusing on this as a general concept, and then we are going to be touching on what it means for post-bac in general, but we want to make this useful for everybody, regardless of whether you decide to apply to or attend this post-bac or any post-bac program. So so let's move on. I am Dr. Alexandra Tan. I am the director of the Johns Hopkins Post-Baccalaureate Program. And when we think about competitiveness, we think about it in a myriad of ways. And if you listen to medical school people talk, others as well, other health professions, they think about it in several different dimensions that in some cases overlap and some don't. So let's start this conversation by focusing on these different dimensions of competitiveness. And this is adapted off of a list by one of our esteemed colleagues at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. So it might be familiar if you've heard her talk, but it's not unique to that particular school. So those dimensions are academics, your metrics, the numbers that are in your application, your clinical experience, your understanding of the field as it relates to that clinical experience, this concept of service to others, to your community, and then interpersonal skills. And there's overlap between these, but there's also some places where there isn't overlap, and we're going to talk about that. And if you look at interpersonal skills and you're like, I think I know what that is, but I'm not really sure what that is, let's be specific about what that means. When medical schools talk about interpersonal skills, they're specifically talking about the interpersonal skills that are part of the core competencies for entering medical school students. This is not a secret. If you Google AAMC core competencies for entering medical school students, you will literally get the same thing that I'm about to show you. It doesn't look like this, but this is the list. If you're interested in another health profession, not medicine, the list is going to be slightly different. They don't necessarily have a published list, but I would say that they are going to care about these same characteristics. All the health profession schools are going to care about capacity for improvement and your ethical responsibility to self and others. They're going to care about your social skills, your quantitative reasoning, et cetera. Like these are just generally important skills. And so you can read more about it there. I do have the link at the top, but if you just Google it, you will get this list of competencies for entering medical school students, and they have a description for each if you want to read into it. That's not the topic of conversation today, but I want to make sure that we're clear on what those are so that that isn't a vague concept for you. So back to this. So when we think about these dimensions of competitiveness, I think the easiest way to get students to think about whether they are or not competitive is to think in the way that health professions schools do, which is to say, what do schools worry about? What's important to the schools? What kinds of questions are they asking themselves? And how are they doing it in each of these dimensions of competitiveness? And so in these four sort of areas, these dimensions of competency, there are some general questions that can go along with this. So in academics, you might be able to guess what the questions would be. Is the student going to be successful in our classes? Do we have the resources to support this student? Right? So even in terms of our post-bac program and others, any health profession school, you can imagine that they're always worried about whether you're going to be successful in their classes and do they have the resources to support you. In the field, does the student know what they're getting into? Do they understand the field well enough to understand the decision that they're making? Is the student in it for the right reasons? So this is like, it's kind of an age-old sort of thing, but like, you shouldn't be going into medicine for the money, right? Yes, it's nice if it's lucrative and you have a living wage, of course, that's great, but you shouldn't be walking into a medical school interview saying, I want to be a doctor because I'm going to make a lot of money, right? They want you to be in it to be the kind of doctor that we all want, right? I want my doctor to be kind. I want my doctor to be respectful. I want them to take care of me. I want to be the center of their attention, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're thinking of the same things. Service also shares this question because medicine is a service profession. And so in it for the right reasons also is reflected in service. And then also very specifically, is this student going to be patient-centric and culturally competent provider? And then finally, does this student have the interpersonal skills necessary to be successful in this team sport of medicine? or whatever the health profession it is, and also at our institution, right? And this is true for post-bac programs as well as medicine. We think about like whether you're going to be a patient-centric, culturally competent provider as well. Certainly in the context of a post-bac program, you're not actually becoming a provider, but you have to be on the path to doing that to be successful as a post-bac student. In terms of interpersonal skills, we also care about whether you have social skills and you're ethically responsible, right? Teamwork, all those things, because that's directly relevant for being part of our community in a post-bac program. So we're going to talk about that more later. I do want to add one other layer because I know what you're thinking. You're like, where's research? Where do I worry about like those things? What about leadership? What about those things? So let's talk about that. So that's less related to these four things and more related to your fit with a particular institution. And this reflects back on this concept that you hopefully have heard before. Hopefully this is not new to you, that each school or program, whether we're talking about health profession schools or we're talking about post-bac programs, are each going to be different and unique in their own way. And so in medical schools, I would say more so than probably post-bac programs, mostly because they have so many applicants and the stakes are much higher, this is reflected as mission-driven admissions. And so this means like they're wanting students that are going to help them achieve their mission. Also part of that is the way that the curriculum is designed. Are you going to be able to thrive there? And then more specifically, does the student know what they're getting into at our institution? So a good example of this is that if my institution, if my medical school requires that students do a research project, do students know that they're going to have to do a research project? And are they like, yay, research project? If they're not, they're going to struggle, right? That's going to be a painful experience for them. And we don't want that to happen. So fit is part of like moving those initiatives forward and it being a comfortable experience. Even in the post-bac program, we have recognized that we have a particular flavor of the way that we do this process of getting students prepared for medical school. And it can be very painful for us and the student if we're both, the student and us, aren't doing a proper job with mission-driven admissions and making sure that the student is aware of and excited about the same things that we are. That's important because we want you to be happy and we want you to be successful while you're here. We don't want it to be a painful experience. And so it's really important that these things get addressed. You also see this with leadership, not just research, and then state residency. So private schools, medical schools, post-bac programs don't tend to be like this, but some are. Private schools don't care about whether you're a resident of the state. So Hopkins School of Medicine is a private institution. They don't care whether you're a Maryland resident or a California resident or a New York resident or whatever. It makes no difference. But if you're applying to a state school, part of their mission might be to provide medical care for the residents of that state. And so they might have some preference in terms of state residents. So good examples of this would be Washington State, Texas State, and then the one I talk to my students a lot about is Southern Illinois University, their medical school. It's like 100% state residents. They almost accept nobody who isn't an Illinois resident. So that's part of like them trying to achieve their mission. And so sometimes you will see that reflected, and then some schools it doesn't make any difference. So these are going to be things that are specific and unique to the school. So the other thing we want to think about when we think about competencies, that other dimension, is we want to make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that we need to demonstrate these competencies. It's not enough to say, let's go back to this one. It's not enough to say, yes, I'm in it for the right reasons. You can't really say that. You have to demonstrate that you're in it for the right reasons. You can't really say I'm culturally competent. You have to demonstrate that you're culturally competent. And so this show me, don't tell me kind of perspective is really important. And so when you're thinking about being a competitive applicant for a health professions program or for a post-bac program, we're not looking for you to say that you possess these skills. We're looking for the demonstration of these skills. Okay, so let's talk a little more about how you demonstrate these and the different ways that that can be accomplished. So one perspective is that this one that I'm illustrating here with the Legos, and you can remember, hopefully recently, that when you're playing with Legos, there's lots of different ways that you can put Legos together and build lots of different things. And so there are particular competencies that can be put together in lots of interesting and unique and different ways. And that's absolutely true with some of the competencies. However, with some of them, that's not the case. There's a very specific way that you need to address it, and trying to treat a puzzle like a Lego set is not going to work. And this may seem like kind of a silly analogy, but we actually see students all the time who are doing this. So let me give you some examples of how this would look. So let's just start with the ones where there are lots of options. So if you're trying to illustrate interpersonal skills, there are lots of ways that you can demonstrate interpersonal skills. So if we're thinking about, let me go back to the original slide. If we're thinking about written competency, it's not like there's only one place where you can demonstrate that, right? Or resilience and adaptability. It's not like there's only one place that is capable of illustrating that point. There are, in fact, tons of different ways. So that's a good example of a place where there are lots of settings, both academic and clinical and service and job, tons of things, personal experiences in your life, relationships. There's lots and lots of ways that you can illustrate that. Service is a little more constrained, but also can be done in lots of different ways. As long as you are serving people, service is service. Okay, so yes, this can be clinical. Yes, this can be community service. It can be tutoring. It can be lots of different things. It can be in your church. It can be faith-based. It can be very classic examples, but it can also be ones that perhaps are not really considered community service. In some ways, it's very much about the way that you present it. And so again, the onus is on you to present it as service. Okay. And then there are some cases where like things that people classically think of service are not service. So for example, if I do a lot of like, if I do a cancer run and I'm just raising money, that's great. I'm glad you're giving back to the community, but as far as medical schools are concerned, you're pretty distant from the community that you're serving. So be aware of the fact that when we're talking about serving others from a medical perspective, you are directly serving people. And so in some ways, things like tutoring, where you're directly providing a service to people in need, that can be more advantageous than like raising money in a run, where really who you're engaging with are people with money. It's of service, but it's not service, if that makes sense. So obviously there are some constraints here, but not a lot in this case. Now let's go to the puzzle pieces. In this specific case, specifics are really better. And so academics is a good example of this. When we're talking about academic fitness, we're talking about academic fitness. And so these are your grades in your classes, and these are standardized test scores, period. And so doing something like having a letter from a clinical experience or a job where somebody talks about how smart you are, that's great. I'm thrilled that they think that you're smart, but that isn't a replacement for success in the classes. We certainly don't view it that way, and health profession schools are not going to view that as a replacement for academic fitness. Why? Well, because at the end of the day, you're taking classes with us, and we need an apples to apples representation of how you're likely to do in that setting. The other one is clinical experience. So clinical experience, depending on what health profession you're thinking about, for us, it's always medical, but if you're here and you're interested in dental or PT or something else, same is true for those in those relevant settings. It means experience in that setting on the clinical side. And this is really important because every once in a while, more often, I would say than not, we have students that are coming to us, particularly in our Career Changer program, who are coming with some kind of thing that they view of as being clinical experience, like these examples, for example, where maybe you're like, you've read a lot of books, you've listened to a lot of Paul Farmer talks, for example, or you have parents who are physicians who talk a lot at the dining room table about what it's like to be a physician or a nurse or whatever. Maybe you've had some significant experiences as a patient, and those have really informed your desire to be a care provider. Or maybe, like, for example, I'm an educator, so I imagine that being a physician is very much like being an educator, except obviously there's the clinical side of it. And so since I've been a patient and I'm an educator, I have the skills necessary to know whether I want to be a doctor or not, right? Maybe somebody feels that way. Those don't really count. Those are a good place to start and say, I want to learn more about this and get more clinical experience, but there's really no replacement for actual clinical experience. And to be clear, when I'm talking about clinical experience, there's lots of ways that that can look. It doesn't have to be in a hospital. It doesn't have to be volunteering. It doesn't have to be an EMT. There's lots of different ways that that can look, but you really need to be on the clinical side, and it really needs to be an actual experience. And so if you're interested in dentistry, it should be in dentistry. You can't take like medical experiences, like MD medical experiences, and say dentistry is probably the same. You can't take MD medical experiences and use them in an occupational therapy application and say it's probably the same. It's not, right? You still have to get those experiences to justify that perspective. So again, show me, right? Show me that you know what you're talking about. So if you go back to this, you need those experiences to show that you know what you're getting into and that you're doing this for the right reasons. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the other question that isn't on this list that schools are thinking about or they're concerned about. And I think just to help you get in the head of admissions people is really important to understand that we do worry about making it worse. Okay, so I know this isn't necessarily the way that applicants think about it, but if we accept somebody who isn't ready for example, the academic rigor of what we have here at Hopkins, we could be making it worse. We could be helping the student dig a hole and helping them accrue a substantial amount of debt. And now they have to take more classes to dig themselves out of the hole that they're in. On the medical school side of that, if you get accepted to medical school on the whim of like, well, maybe they can do it, and you flunk out because you weren't ready, that's it. You're never getting accepted to another medical school. The dream is dead. So medical schools are not wanting to accept students who might not be ready. Part of it is having attrition and losing one more provider that could contribute to the health and well-being of the area, the country, the community, whatever. But also part of it is like, we're trying to do right by everybody we accept. And we at Hopkins at least feel like when we accept a student, we genuinely believe that they have a very good chance of being successful here. And we take that very seriously. I can't say that for everybody else, but certainly we've heard that from a lot of our health professions colleagues. And so to nail that down and think more deeply about that, I want to help you understand this relative to your own application by thinking of high risk and low risk, because this is the way that we think about it, at least, and a lot of health profession schools have also talked about it. And so obviously the goal here is to be low risk, right? You want to be a sure bet. So if we use an analogy of playing cards, I think the two relevant questions here is to what extent do we care about this particular quality? And then what is the risk if we make a particular decision? So for example, if I'm playing cards with my kids and we're playing with M&Ms, that's very low risk, right? The worst thing that's going to happen is that they're going to eat all of my M&Ms. That's not the same thing as playing cards at like a high stakes table where I've got $1 million at stake and I could lose like my entire retirement. Obviously, that's very high risk relative to this. The other thing is this question about what do we care about? And so it could be maybe that, like, for example, we talked about research. So if I'm a medical school that doesn't require that students do research, I might say, well, I don't really care if you have research or not. That's not something I particularly care about. And so it doesn't make you a higher low risk candidate, whether you have research or not. But if you're applying to an MD PhD program where research is a big part of what you do with us, obviously I care a lot more about that. So the point we're making here is that I want to show you this and give you a kind of way of thinking about it, but this is super subjective. And so I'm going to show you like basically how this works, and then I'm going to give you an example. So obviously on the different axes here, we have how much we care about something and what are the chances of it happening. And so this is not where you want to be. something they care a lot about, and something that's very high risk. So an example of this would be having a very low GPA at an institution that is very rigorous, right? The chances of this being relevant, the chances of maybe you being unsuccessful, that's a very high risk if you have like, a 2.0 GPA. That's very high risk. Does it mean that it's possible that you could be successful? Yes, of course you could be successful. I hear a lot of students say, just take a chance on me. The thing is that in admissions, we don't like chance, right? We're not looking to take a chance. We're not like going to Las Vegas with students' lives and admissions. We want sure things. And so we're not living in that red square or that dark gray square if you're colorblind. The one that's low on these two corners, this is where we want to live, right? In fact, this is where we want to live. We really want applicants that are either, if you are all over the map on things, we don't particularly care about it, or the chances of something bad happening is very low. That's what we want. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. So let me just mention again that post-bac programs are in between your college experience and medical school. And so when we think about competitiveness, it is not as hardcore as medical schools, but somewhere in the middle. So we care about all these same things that medical schools care about, but to a lesser degree. The one exception to that is academic relative to the rigor of our classes. Obviously not as hard as medical schools, but particular to our institution. So here's the example that I want to convey to you that I think is pretty black and white and hopefully will help. So on the screen, you have an illustration of a 2-year post-bac program. So career changer programs that are 2-year programs are going to give you 2 years to take the year of chemistry, the year of biology, the year of organic chemistry, and the year of physics. And so essentially this is kind of close to the speed at which you would take them as an undergrad. And so this is absolutely doable. For programs like ours, we take the same number of courses, the same number of credits, and we cram them into 1 year. So you're not getting something for nothing. It's literally the same. Medical schools would not accept it if it were different. So if we cut the credit hours in half to make it comfortable, medical schools would be like, yeah, that's great, but you're short on credits. So it wouldn't work. So it's the exact same thing. So what happens is that when you shorten the time period, keep the credits the same, we're actually really packing in the time. So you're trading your extra time for the convenience of the shortness. And so when we think about this question, is the student going to be successful in our classes? It's subjective for the rigor and the difficulty of what our students in particular are undertaking. So if we had a 2-year program here at Hopkins, which unfortunately we don't, but if we did, we would inherently review them differently because the answer to this question, is the student going to be successful in our classes, would be different for 2 years versus 1 year. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. It's just fundamentally different. It also matters that we're Hopkins and the classes are very rigorous here. I don't mean that to sound braggish, but different programs have different amount of resources for students. The rigor is different. Megan reminded me this week that some of the programs have tried to expand the amount of time that you spend in a clinical space, but they've also compressed the amount of time that you spend in the classroom. And so that matters. That's very similar to what you have on the screen. And so that means that like the rigor goes up. And so then it matters. So we have an upcoming open access education on metrics in January that I will refer back to at the end, but I did want to give you an example of this relative to risk, just this one example. It's very black and white, and so hopefully this makes sense. So this is directly off our website, just to give you an example from the post-bac. You can also do this with the medical schools and other programs, and in the metrics talk in January, I will be showing you that, but I don't want to spend time on it now. So this is off of our website, and what you see here is the data we've given you, which mimics the way that medical schools give data, sort of. And so you see the cumulative undergraduate GPA. I've also included the text. And so you're told that the cumulative undergraduate GPAs for students admitted to the program is between a 3.2 and a 4.0, and the mean is a 3.82. So translating that, the endpoints of what you see are the point at which everybody is above it and the point at which everyone is below it, right? And then the mean is in the middle. Everybody still with me? Okay. So what exactly does that mean? Well, if we interpose the risk perspective on this, that basically means this. What you see in a nutshell from this is that the folks, you can glean from this that the folks below where that 0 percentile is, that's a high risk category for us. Does it mean that nobody would ever be admitted below that point? No, you're specifically told that there are no minimum GPAs. But it does say students with a GPA below 3.0 are not likely to be competitive. What we're saying is students below a 3.0 are not likely to be able to positively answer these questions. When we think about, is this student going to be successful in our classes? It is really hard in most cases for a student below a 3.0 for us to answer yes to that question, or to feel good about answering yes to that question. That's what we mean when we say are not likely to be competitive. Hopefully that makes sense. And so you can see here, our mean is at a 3.8. And so you can see definitely at the mean and above it, obviously, people in that GPA range, they're very low risk for us. We know that students around the mean and above the mean definitely are fine in our classes. How do we know that? 20 years worth of data. We see those folks going through and being successful. We know they're going to be okay, right? But there's also the long tail for that for us, which also means there's a lot of gray area. And so the gray area is the part that isn't colored here, or if you're colorblind, the part that's white. And that's very subjective. It depends on your school. It depends on your major. It depends on how long it's been since you've been in classes. It depends on the combination of information we have for you. It depends on the totality of your application because we do holistic review. So yes, we've absolutely accepted a student who is at a 3.2. Yes, we've accepted students who are at a 3.3. Yes, we've accepted students at a 3.4. The majority of people that we've accepted are in this range. How do you know that? Because that's where the mean is, right? Generally speaking, mathematically, the population is going to circle the mean. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense mathematically. So let's talk about why this happens. I think the why is really important to understand general competitiveness and to really put you in a state of mind that allows you to make the best decisions. So a lot of times when students are thinking about admissions, whether to post-bac programs or to health profession schools, this is the part that they're focused on. They're focused on the getting in, which I 100% get. It's a to-do list item. Our students are definitely hyper-focused on just getting accepted. We hear that a lot. I just want to get accepted. I 100% get it. But it's important to realize that that's not what I'm thinking about. I am not thinking about, gosh, I hope they just get accepted. What I'm worried about and what admissions committees are worried about and what health profession schools are worried about is not admitting people. It's how are they going to do once they're here? So it's important that you think about that as a frame of reference because that's what the people who are looking at your application are thinking about. It's not just give me a chance, let me in. It's once you get in, how are you going to do when you're here? That's the thing that we worry about and keeps us up at night, sort of. This is something you should be focused on too. It's great to get into things, but the better thing than getting into medical school, I know it's hard to imagine that there's anything better than getting into medical school, but the better thing is finishing medical school and graduating. That's the better thing, right? You want to be somebody not just that gets in, but graduates and finishes and is successful, right? We always focus on the thing that's immediately in front of us. It's a human thing, but you want to be cognizant of the fact that there's that endpoint. You want to be in the best position to be successful as possible. And so I would encourage you to think about admissions committee not as these like security officers and gatekeepers. I often hear as admissions as gatekeeping. From our perspective, it's not gatekeeping. We're not like bouncers at a nightclub trying to decide like who's worthy and who's not worthy. This is more like that you must be this tall to ride this ride sign that is at roller coasters, right? That's not like a meanness thing, like let's be mean to children and not allow them the fun of being on a roller coaster. This is if you were a small person, you could fall out and die. That's completely different, right? It's a safety measure. So from an admissions perspective, we're trying to keep you safe. I know it doesn't always feel that way. And the problem is that there's a lot of false negatives with the system, and it's really hard to control, right? So again, the way that you keep from being a false negative is showing us that you're not, showing us that you are a sure bet, showing us that you're high risk. So in the interest of doing that, let's talk about what you can do. All right. So hopefully you're in a good position and you're like, yes, I know exactly how to do that. I have everything I need. I have a plan of attack. I'm in a good place. Fantastic. We would love to see your application. I can't wait to talk to you. But let's talk about what happens if maybe that's not the case. Turns out it's actually easier than you would think. And on the admission side, we often talk about people not as being rejected, but as being not accepted yet. And the whole principle of that is not that you can never be successful, but that you're not in the best place to be successful yet, right? So this is like my youngest, who is not a tall person and desperately wants to be on a roller coaster. It's not that he will never ride a roller coaster. At some point, he will be tall enough to ride a roller coaster, but it's not safe yet. Okay, so you want to put yourself in a position where you can be successful and thrive and you're ready to go. So how do you do that? Well, let's talk about these each separately, super briefly. Academically, if you're going to demonstrate that you can be successful in the classroom, then the easiest way to demonstrate is to show being successful in the classroom. That's the easiest way to do it, right? Apples to apples. My encouragement would be if there are things that have kept, not necessarily who, but that have kept you from being successful in the classroom, fix those first and then show success in the classroom. It's not just one class. It's not like if you've had multiple semesters of poor performance and you take one class and you get an A, you're like, proved. You want to show improvement, like consistent, that we're going to say, okay, whatever the issue is, it's been addressed. That's fine. Test scores, you retake the test, apples to apples, right? Now, if it's ACT or SAT for us, or other post-bac programs that accept those, we also accept a GRE. So you can't, at your age, go back and take the ACT or the SAT again, but you can go and take the GRE instead. If you're coming to us because you want this information and we're talking about application to medical school or dental school or whatever, then you just retake the MCAT or the DAT or whatever it is. Obviously, don't run and go take it. Prepare and retake it. Know the exam, do some practice tests, etc. For reference for us, our graduate level, I guess, exams that we accept are definitely the GRE, but we have at times also accepted like the LSAT, etc. So if you have some other exams that are mostly the same, you can talk to us about whether we accept those so you don't have to take new ones. But there are other opportunities that are available to you. And then the last three are super easy. If you don't have any clinical experience, you get clinical experience. If you don't have service, go get service. If you don't feel like you have a demonstration of your interpersonal skills, go do that. There is no penalty for like not having experience. You just go and get experience that you don't have, right? And I want to do a shout out to my career changer students. Medical schools will not hold it against you that you haven't wanted to be a doctor or dentist or whatever from birth. Nobody cares. The thing that matters is not how long you've wanted to do it, but that you've invested the time and energy into understanding the field. Notice that on my questions here, keep going back to the same slide. The question is not how long have you wanted to be a doctor? There is no worthiness that comes from having wanted to do this from birth. All right. How do I know? Well, because I run a career changer program and we have a very high acceptance rate, and none of them, well, maybe I shouldn't say none. All of them except for a small handful have not wanted to do this from birth. And they still get in on the first attempt all the time. All right. So the other thing that I want to impress upon you, just to be thorough in my information, is that especially if you're thinking about admissions to health profession schools, but certainly post-bac programs as well and other kinds of programs, is that if you don't meet, like, for example, the academic standards or the test score standards for some institutions, you can also avoid this by considering other schools and other fields, because the competitiveness is subjective. Okay, so relevant to this, not being competitive for a one-year program doesn't necessarily mean that you're not competitive for a two-year program. In fact, you may be likely to be competitive for a two-year program, or not competitive for Hopkins doesn't mean that you wouldn't be competitive for other programs. So remember that this concept of risk is relative to the program and the rigor, et cetera, and the resources that are available at that particular program. Because again, it's subjective. All schools and all programs are unique. And so those differences definitely matter. Okay, so one last thing that I want to point out to you before we finish and do questions is that I really, really, really want to impress upon you that it's super important that you get your information in the right places. There's this very old saying about when you understand one medical school, you understand one medical school. And I would say the same thing is true for post-bac programs. If you understand one post-bac program, you understand one post-bac program. And so it's really important that you're getting your information either from the literature or from school representatives like us or health professions, obviously. And then you can trust the information that you're getting from your health professions advisor. I know you guys like to talk to each other, but peer-to-peer advising can be very dangerous, and it can be like the black swamp of despair. Okay, notice on my list, I didn't put Reddit. Not the best place for you to get advising support. We have found a lot of times that that's usually where students have gotten information when they're in our offices crying, because you don't get good information. If somebody says you're definitely getting into medical school or you're definitely not getting into medical school, you're getting your information in the wrong place. I would never tell my students you definitely are, you definitely aren't. I don't have a crystal ball. I have no idea. What I can speak to is risk. What I can speak to is statistical likelihood of something. I can tell you whether you have a high risk application or a low risk application, but that does not mean that you're not going to be accepted. It does mean maybe that your chances are good or not good, but anybody that tells you you're definitely getting accepted or you're definitely not getting accepted, I don't know where you would be getting that information. Even if they serve on an admissions committee is like 40 people, and one person who's certain of an outcome does not make an admissions committee decision. They could absolutely say 100% we have to accept this person, and they still might not be accepted. We've seen that happen. So you gotta think about high risk versus low risk. Okay, so I do have some links on here, and when I close this, I can put them in the chat. But this is readily available information. The AAMC has a lot of information just readily available on their website. I try not to use resources for things like this that you guys don't have access to. You don't have to believe me, you can check. And you can listen to your health profession schools. The message is going to shift based on who's talking, not hugely. I try to make these pretty general. Okay, so we're going to do questions, but while we get ready for that, I do want to point out that we do, if you're not already familiar, we do have some other open access education recordings. If you go to our website where you registered for this and where our information sessions are, you will see that we have one about experiences. What should you be doing? We do talk about like online and such because pandemic. And then if you are applying to post-bac programs and you're not sure how to think about linkage, since that's a question we get a lot, we did an open access education on that. And then one that's coming up in January is on metrics. And so that is the continuation of the conversation that we started today about how to think about metrics and how to deal with metrics. And I'm going to do a deeper dive into how to kind of analyze data that you're given by programs like ours, as well as medical schools. I'll show you some different medical schools and talk more about like, how do you know what is competitive and not competitive relative to a single school, and how do you know that? We're going to be focused on medical schools because we have such good data for them, but if you have any data for other kinds of programs, then it's relevant to that as well. So hopefully you will go and register, and then like this one, the recording will be on the website. So with that, we're going to go to questions.